For some time now, the traditional doctrine of hell has been under fire. Traditions maintain that an everlasting hell, a place of both self-imposed exile and retributive punishment, is consistent with God's perfect goodness. They thereby face the charge that evil, in the form of both punitive suffering and moral rebellion, will also be eternal. This is a challenge recently reiterated by James Spiegel, for whom a perpetual hell would be in contradiction to God's ultimate reconciliation of all things to himself through Christ. See Colossians chapter 1, verse 20. A revisiting of Thomas Aquinas' defense of the traditional doctrine can go some way towards meeting Spiegel's objection. For Aquinas, both the suffering and disobedience of the perpetually defiant are permissible because of the place hell will have in the final age, when all parts, even bad ones, will be divinely ordered towards the perfected whole. Both the affliction and sin in hell, though evil in themselves, will be oriented to the justice God ensures for his new creation. In his recently published Hell and Divine Goodness, a philosophical theological inquiry, Spiegel sets out two difficulties that he thinks beset the traditional doctrine. One, the problem of eternal suffering, and two, that of eternal sin. He argues that everlasting suffering would be gratuitous, having no point beyond itself, while perpetual sin would be defiling, implying God's refusal to fully vanquish evil. Throughout Hell and Divine Goodness, the traditional view is evaluated with respect to both conditionalism, the view that the unsaved will be ultimately annihilated, and universalism, the view that all will be eventually saved. It's beyond the scope of my paper to examine an overall critique of the traditional doctrine vis-a-vis both conditionalism and universalism. Rather, I will address Spiegel's specific charge that neither eternal affliction nor eternal sin could be permitted by God in the age to come. 1. The problem of eternal suffering in hell. Assume, Spiegel begins, that for any affliction allowed or caused by God, he has a sufficient reason. As witnessed to in Scripture, such reasons might include joy upon Christ's return, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 13, purification of faith, 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 to 7, and perseverance, hope, and good character, Romans chapter 5, verses 3 to 4. In each case, Spiegel argues, there is a higher positive end in view, an ultimate redemptive point to the suffering that we experience. In contrast, there can be no redemptive point when it comes to eternal conscious torment in hell, because for the damned there is nothing beyond the suffering. Spiegel's claim that endless affliction would be non-redemptive is correct, but question-begging. For in the traditional view, everlasting punishment is for the sake of divine justice. Damnation is not rehabilitative, but retributive. Anticipating this rebuttal, Spiegel objects that damnation as God's retribution would be unjust because it fails to meet the criterion of proportionality, that the severity of the penalty should match that of the offense. Because this objection, the everlasting punishment is unjust, is also related to the problem of eternal sin, I will consider it later. Spiegel has a second argument against taking divine justice to be the higher end of perpetual punishment. Quote, some traditionalists appeal to the venting of the wrath of God as the end served by eternal conscious torment, which satisfies God. If the torment of the damned must be infinite in order to achieve ultimate retributive justice and thus satisfy God's wrath, then at no point in the duration of these torments is real justice ever achieved, since never at any point is the penalty fully paid. If retributive justice is never achieved, then God's wrath can never be satisfied. And if God's wrath cannot be satisfied by eternal conscious torment, then it's difficult to see how God could find the execution of the penalty satisfying. Close quote. And here, satisfaction, doesn't mean contentment, but sufficiency from the Latin satisfacere. If, paradoxically, God is never satisfied by eternal punishment, then the resultant perpetual suffering cannot be ordered towards divine justice, or so Spiegel argues. At the same time, endless affliction cannot be ordered towards redemption either, because neither the damned themselves, the saved, the angels, nor God himself would benefit. Nothing salvific could be achieved by eternal suffering, so God would have no sufficient reason to allow or cause it. Spiegel thus concludes that perpetual suffering would be gratuitous, having no purpose beyond itself. As seen, Spiegel's conclusion depends on his contention that everlasting punishment would not, in fact, be satisfying for God. Aquinas would reply that this alleged paradox of perpetual non-satisfaction is an illusion. God is not like a chain smoker who can never take enough puffs and thereby quell his addiction. Rather, God is forever satisfied, instead of forever in need of satisfaction, when his decrees are perfectly fulfilled, no matter that the effects of his causes must unfold in time. Even if God is in time, a matter Spiegel takes no stand on, God can become satisfied the moment the rebellious are consigned to hell and then remain such as they forever serve their sentence. Thus, everlasting punishment need not be decreed by God at every time, regardless of the wrongdoer's response at a later time. Aquinas maintains in the Summa Contra Gentiles that endless punishment would not be the case if the defiant were repentant. Quote, there would be no everlasting punishment of the souls of the damned if they were able to change their will for a better will. It would be unjust indeed if from the moment of their having a good will, their punishment would be everlasting. Close quote. So the rationale for their perpetual punishment is quite simply their continued defiance. Aquinas again contends in the Compendium Theologiae, quote, eternal punishment is inflicted on a sinner who does not repent of his sin, and so he continues in his sin up to his death. And since he is in sin for eternity, he is reasonably punished by God for all. Close quote. If the damned are punished endlessly because their wills are permanently given over to evil, then God can be satisfied at every moment. If, as Aquinas also thinks, God is outside time, then he will be atemporally satisfied. Contra Spiegel, perpetual punishment does not paradoxically imply perpetual non-satisfaction. Moreover, even if perpetual punishment is excessive, it does not follow that the resultant eternal suffering would be gratuitous. Rather, it is permanently ordered towards divine justice. Aquinas agrees in the Summa Theologiae that, quote, God does not delight in punishments for their own sake, but he does delight in the order of his justice which requires them, close quote. 2. The problem of eternal sin. Recall that Spiegel claims that if punishment is retributive, eternal damnation would be unjust because it does not meet the criterion of proportionality. Among other things, human guilt that is not repented for before death cannot be infinite because moral capacities are finite. Just as virtue has an upper limit, so vice has a lower limit. Hence, everlasting punishment is not justifiable, something God would neither permit nor cause. At this point in his book, Spiegel is not primarily arguing that everlasting punishment is unjust. He does make a fuller case for this in the previous chapter. Rather, he is chiefly contending that everlasting sin would be inconsistent with creation's renewal and elevation. As has been noted, Aquinas would retort that perpetual punishment is not unjust because the damned will always sin. Even if their guilt at death is not actually infinite, it is ever present owing to the refusal of God's friendship. Spiegel is aware of this sort of rebuttal, though, countering it thus, quote, by basing the justification for eternal conscious torment on the notion that the damned sin perpetually in hell, the traditionalist aims to avoid affirming infinite human sinfulness and the devastating implications for their view this carries with it. Unfortunately for the traditionalists, the continuing sin thesis fails to salvage their view. Since the sin of the damned continues forever, and thus always demands more punishment, for all eternity, there remains unpunished moral evil, specifically the sin committed by the damned that next needs to be punished. Moral evil, on the continuing sin thesis, springs eternal. Close quote. If the damned forever rebel against God, then not just sin, but unpunished sin will always exist. No matter that hell would be far removed from the new heavens and earth, eternal sin would still imply God's unwillingness to reconcile all creation to himself. To respond, Aquinas would need a way to justify God's permission of continued evil after the eschaton. Though he does not explicitly provide one in his discussions of the conditions of hell, his views on the nature of both goodness and evil are the basis of an answer to Spiegel. John Lamont has distinguished between a contemporary accounting conception of value and Aquinas' teleological one. On an accounting model, good and evil are simply quantities that are commensurable with each other, i.e., greater versus lesser goods, greater versus lesser evils, a state of affairs of greater net good versus one of lesser net good. By contrast, on a teleological model, good and evil are functions of the ends of beings. Goodness consists in the attaining of those ends, badness in not attaining them. Moreover, given teleological ordering, parts are in distinct relations to the whole, such that a bad part can nonetheless contribute to the whole's goodness. Suppose rabbits are introduced into an ecosystem that did not have any, and they then begin to reproduce rapidly. As a dramatically growing rapid population outcompetes smaller animals for food, the ecosystem becomes strained. In a teleological account, the net value of this state of affairs is not the good for the rabbits minus the bad for the ecosystem. Rather, the net value is absolutely negative. The rabbits achieve what is good for them, to be flourishing rabbits, while the ecosystem does not achieve what is good for it, to be a flourishing ecosystem. Here, what is good for the part is bad for the whole. Conversely, were the rabbit herds to start dying from some disease, their deaths would be bad for them, but good for the ecosystem. What is bad for the part would be good for the whole. As Lamont notes, given the distinction between an accounting conception and a teleological one, thinkers who hold to differing assumptions are talking past each other. Spiegel appears to assume that everlasting unpunished sin would be evil, and nothing else. It would be a permanent blot on God's new creation. Aquinas, on the other hand, thinks that the diversity of things in the universe is for its perfection. He freely admits that if better means more good things or more kinds of them, or less bad things or less kinds of them, then God can create a better world than the actual one. At the same time, he also contends that if better means an improved order or proportion of things to one another, then God cannot create a better world than the actual one. On account of his perfect wisdom and foreknowledge, any world God creates, even if it had many bad parts, would be a good whole. We read in the Summa Theologiae, quote, "The universe, the present creation being supposed, cannot be better on account of the most beautiful order given to things by God, in which the good of the universe consists. For if any one thing were better, the proportion of order would be destroyed. As if one string were stretched more than it ought to be, the melody of the harp would be destroyed. Yet God could make other things, or add something to the present creation, and then there will be another and better universe." Close quote. Analogously, while the new creation without hell may be better in the accounting sense, since we'll have less bad things, a new creation with hell is not worse in the teleological sense, because, like any other world God have created, it necessarily exhibits his wise proportioning. No doubt, the teleological view of value must be more fundamental than the accounting one for an everlasting hell to be defensible here. Lamont observes, quote, "The traditional answer to the problem of evil, as found in Augustine and Aquinas, is not that evil is necessarily permitted for the sake of goods that outweigh it, but that God brings it about that the whole of creation is entirely good in the end." Close quote. Now, Spiegel contends that eternal sin is not something God would permit if he intends the reconciliation of all things to himself. How, one might ask, could hell, with both his perpetual suffering and sin, contribute to the goodness of the perfected world? As has been seen, the answer for Aquinas is that the new creation's goodness involves God's wise ordering, his just arrangement of things to one another. The beatific vision will be apportioned to the redeemed, and perpetual punishment to the lost, all in accordance with the same principle of justice. Again, we read in the Summa Theologiae, quote, "Now, we have to concede that punishments are not inflicted by God for their own sake, as if God delighted in them, but they are for something else, namely for the imposing of order on creatures, in which the order of the good of the universe consists. Now, this order of things demands that all things be divinely arranged in a proportionate way. This is why it is said in the Book of Wisdom, chapter 11, verse 21, that God made all things in weight, number, and measure. Now, just as rewards are in proportional correspondence with the acts of the virtues, so are punishments with sins. And to some sins are proportioned eternal punishments, as we showed. So God inflicts eternal punishment for certain sins so that the due order may be observed in things, which order manifests his wisdom." Close quote. The new creation will be a good whole because, among other things, it manifests complete justice. Notwithstanding their evilness, both perpetual affliction and sin in hell will have its place in the final age, for just as those who have wrongly suffered will be justly graced, so those who have unrepentantly rebelled will be justly sentenced. Aquinas' defense of the traditional doctrine of hell as a place of both punitive suffering and moral rebellion is undoubtedly difficult to accept today. What the foregoing has revealed is how the traditional view is informed by a certain axiological principle, namely the teleological conception, and if the latter is defensible, the former may be as well. Spiegel does not object to punishment per se, but only to the everlasting variety. If God allows or causes suffering, it must be for the person's eventual redemption. On this view, punishment, when warranted, seems to be a necessary evil justified only to the extent that greater good ultimately emerges from it. By contrast, for Aquinas, punishment is good because it involves restoring the proper relationship between virtue and happiness and that between vice and unhappiness. On this understanding, the principle of retribution is not independently justified, but flows from the teleological conception of good and evil. From within the whole that is the redeemed cosmos, the part that is everlasting hell is restorative, Aquinas would hold. The bad for the lost, both their anguish and sin, is a contribution to the good of the new creation, itself an expression of God's justice. Hell is not outside God's providence. Nothing is. So its evil, though permanent, cannot ultimately constitute a disproportion between his will and the world's consummation. Thank you.